Alana, do you want to bring up the agenda? We are just getting started. Alana my colleague will bring up the agenda, just so everyone knows who is on the call, if you will, for purposes of the record. We have Doctors Barr, Berenson, Haft, Reedman, Okiki, and other members. We have Bob Atlas, we have Debbie Kuchka-Craig. And if you did not hear your name called, can you please let me know that you are either on the phone or online? That would be great. Okay, I'm hearing none. Melanie, can you please make the operational announcements for us?
Yes, thank you, David. So good evening, everyone. We want to remind everyone that the meeting will be recorded. So we do have a special announcement tonight. So in the event that this meeting is hacked, please hang up immediately. Alana will send you an email through the MDPCP mailbox with a new link, and that will allow you to log back in. The meeting recording will be available to the public or to anyone who isn't able to log back into the new meeting link, because we won't be putting that new meeting link up to the MHCC website for the public. Please contact Aneta or Melanie or send a chat message if you're having any technical issues. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking to hold down the background noise. You can mute and unmute yourself using the little microphone button at the bottom of your screen. Staff may mute you if there's a lot of background noise, but you're always able to unmute yourself. You are welcome to use the chat function, but it does send the note to all attendees. You can't send a chat message to a specific attendee with this technology. Please announce yourself when speaking, and everyone is free to speak throughout the meeting. But since there are a lot of people, we'd like to sequence speakers when possible. So signal to the team. One method is holding something up so that David can see that you're interested in speaking. And the facilitator will also call on people to ensure that we have a wide range of perspectives. You can put in the chat function a question and I'll read it to the group as well. The last thing I would say is please look at the position of your camera so that it's not just like cutting off your forehead and up, so that it actually shows your face. So I think that's all I have for now, David. So I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Reedman, any remarks before we get started?
No, I just had a couple of procedural issues tonight. Again, welcome everybody. I really appreciate the effort y'all have made and continue to make over the last number of months and will till the end of the year at least. I think that tonight's conversation should be really interesting. I think we're getting to the meat of what we've been hoping to get to. We've got some actual analysis and some numbers to present, and I think the PowerPoint presentation is going to be excellent. During the PowerPoint presentation, I would suggest that in the interest of trying to get through the data that we're going to pause frequently after each subject. And so I would, if you have a really burning question, you need to interrupt. Obviously, we keep these conversations open, and we certainly have been informal about it. But for tonight, I'd like to say that we get through kind of at least each section, and then we'll open it up for questions. And if you have a question during that period, just let us know and raise your white flag. Otherwise, Melanie will kind of keep track of who has questions, and we'll kind of go in order. So keep that in mind. But I think you'll find tonight's presentation really interesting, and I think we'll have some really good conversation. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Dr. Reedman. So Dr. Haft, we will get started with the PMO update.
Great, thank you, David, and thank you, Michael. Welcome everyone again to our Tuesday night deliberations on the Track 3 for the Maryland Primary Care Program. And I will be very brief. I want to just say that we continue to meet and discuss this very important project with CMMI. We'll continue to iterate with them on versions of our deliberations. We're moving now to a different format in order to facilitate a more complete version at the end of this calendar year. We're translating the work and the comments that are provided here in these meetings into a text version that looks like an RFA, and that's mutually agreed upon into a format that we'll iterate with them. They've also asked that we will provide background data such as it influences our decision-making, our joint decision-making and recommendations for policy and changes. And that's part of the process that we're going to move through tonight, is presenting data so that we can additionally provide that data to CMMI so they can understand what drives our decision-making. Next, I'd say that we'll be moving in our next series of discussions to looking at moving past where we are now, looking at the performance, to look at the performance measures, knowing that we want to align performance measures and the weighting of those measures to be in alignment with the Maryland model, the total cost of care, and the state integrated health improvement strategy, which is different than the measures that are currently in Primary Care First. So in that regard, we are engaging an actuary together with the Hilltop Institute. Hilltop, as you know, does a lot of the modeling work for Medicaid, and has worked with us in a number of projects. So that'll be in the next several weeks forward from where we are now. We'll be looking at actuarial data on performance measures. And last, just for your information, as you know, seriously ill populations is part of the Primary Care First model. We've had some discussions with individuals in Maryland, Dr. Bruce Leff and his colleagues from other places, who are in the Independence at Home program, which is scheduled to sunset possibly at the end of this year. One of the considerations for Primary Care First is that those Independence at Home practices may be able to join Primary Care First, and we will be in discussions with them both to get their insight about seriously ill populations, and also their interest in joining the Track 3 potentially in the future as we roll that out in 2023. But most importantly tonight, we want to turn it over to our great colleagues, Audrey Spader and others from H-Metrics, who have been great partners in almost everything we've developed in terms of technology and data analysis over the last several years. So I'll just turn it over to Audrey now, who will walk us through the big blocks of how we look at creating population-based payments, and how we look at creating flat fees, and how those come together to create an overall payment model. So Audrey, I turn it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Huff. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to reviewing the results of our preliminary analysis with you tonight, and hopefully providing some introductory information and analyses to really open up the discussion to then determine kind of what's next for Track 3 for the MDPCP program. So on the next slide is just a quick review of what we're going to cover over the next hour and a little bit. I'll provide brief analytic context of what got us to this point. I imagine everybody on the line is very familiar with this, but just want to get us all on the same starting page. I'll also then review the H-Metrics scope of work and review with you what we have taken on to assist in the modeling for Track 3. From there, I'll highlight some key assumptions, some key findings, and the required policy decisions that need to be made. You will see throughout this presentation that while we are presenting preliminary results, we will also stop periodically and say, these are the big questions on the table right now. We welcome everybody's feedback on that now, but we also welcome everybody to kind of take it back, think about it a little bit, and come back to the group and have more robust conversations in the future based on the analyses that we provide. We will provide then preliminary results for the 3 components of Track 3 payment modeling: the population-based payment, the flat fee amount, and the total primary care payment. We also provide some provider impacts in brief to just get everybody situated on not only what the overall impact is of our modeling, but how it could impact individual providers. We will recap the policymaking decisions at the end and talk about our next analytic steps. So on the next slide, our analytic context. So again, this should be familiar to all of you on the line at this point, but we are looking at developing a 3rd track for the MDPCP program. And the real intent of this additional track is to bring alignment and accountability within the context of total cost of care. So we're looking at not only population-based payment to provide care management fees, as well as E&M services, but also performance adjustments that will hold providers accountable for their performance for their attributed population. We recognize that we're working on a very expedited basis, and information is due to CMS by the end of the year. So that's why we have these preliminary results for you tonight. All of the analyses that we have started with are anchored back to the National Primary Care First initiative. So I will make sure to point out where we are consistent with PCF, but also where we deviate. There are some fairly significant places where we need to deviate from PCF simply because we're looking at a Maryland-specific model in MDPCP, and it may differ from the national framework. And then, of course, our payment modeling to determine the potential impact and help us design a policy that is most appropriate moving forward. On the next slide is our H-metrics scope of work. We've broken everything down into 5 tasks. And today we are going to cover the preliminary results for our first 3 tasks. So we've modeled our population-based payment, and we have two different payment models we'll review with you. We have modeled our flat fee, and we have a few different permutations we'll consider. And then we've brought 1 and 2 together to produce the total primary care payment, which is ultimately the impact for providers under this policy. 4 and 5 are issues that we're going to come up with in the future. So we'll be attacking payment adjustments and looking to understand that in more detail, as well as identifying the seriously ill population and how that seriously ill population could be brought into the larger track 3 and what the implications would be from a program perspective. We will not be handling quality gateway or behavioral impacts, at least not at this point. So we're going to keep it at a high level for now. All right, on the next slide. This is just a visualization to show you how the components of PCF relate back to our scope of work. And I think in brief, it's effectively your population-based payment plus the flat fee for select E&M services is going to produce the total primary care payment. That total payment is then adjusted by the performance-based adjustment. And then we have the seriously ill population that gets kind of interjected into all of this. So again, for tonight, we're going to cover those first 3 tasks, PBP plus flat fee equaling the total primary care payment. Okay, on the next slide, please. I think we can get into content. So that was just a quick introduction. I want to lay out some key assumptions right at the front to make sure that everyone understands what we've worked through. And we may need to revisit this slide a few times throughout our presentation. So to start, we have made the key assumption that all current MDPCP Track 2 practices are assumed to transition to Track 3. So we're taking the initial framework that all 122 Track 2 practices that are currently enrolled in the MDPCP program are going to transition over to Track 3 in this new modeling. We base our beneficiary assumptions based on Q3 2020 attribution, and we make no assumptions on changes in either practice participation or beneficiary participation, or the composition of the beneficiaries in this modeling. So we're starting from a true kind of static state that if today Track 3 were to exist, all of Track 2 beneficiaries were to transition into Track 3 with no changes in the number of beneficiaries attributed or the complexity or risk of those beneficiaries. Those are later dynamic elements that would be able to be brought in, but we're not quite there yet. Next, the modeled payments are going to be based on the PBP payments under the Primary Care First program. It is the group rates that you'll see in that middle table at the bottom. We do not apply geographic adjustment at the point of payment, so those are exactly as you see them incorporated into our model. Likewise, our current modeling is based on the CMF payments for current Track 2 tier payments. Those are shown on the table to the bottom right. Again, no geographic adjustment is applied to those at the time of payment. And last, when we get to our flat fee rate, we have several different permutations of how a flat fee payment can be developed. But our utilization is based on all of calendar year 2019 we've adjusted, or actually repriced, all of the E&M services to be consistent with the proposed Medicare payments. So that is the NPRM proposed payments under the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule for 2021. All of that can be finalized once the rule becomes finalized. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and I can provide some high-level summary of findings. There's a lot of detail that underlines just these few bullet points here, but I want to make sure that we get out in front of it, let you know what our overall model is finding, and then I can provide the detail and the buildup of how we got to these results. So as I mentioned, we have two different models that we've developed. On the left-hand side, we are looking at a practice group analysis. This practice group is consistent with the way that Primary Care First is developed. You have a single practice that has an average HCC score for all of their attributed beneficiaries, and that practice is assigned to a single group. That group is either, the practice is receiving a population-based payment according to that group under PCF. And we're modeling the impact of using this practice group framework. Having a model of this framework, we are finding that the overall model will decrease payments to Track 2 practices by 12.5%. That is after factoring in the population-based payment as well as the flat fees.
I'm sorry, decrease it relative to what?
A decrease relative to the current payments that they would have received under Track 2.
Track 2. Okay, thanks.
So our analysis is comparing Track 2 current payments compared to modeled payments under Track 3. Under this scenario would be a model that's very similar to Primary Care First.
Okay.
So while we have an overall decrease of 12.5% across the program, the provider-specific impact can vary quite drastically. We have providers that would lose up to select practices would have a 28% reduction in payment. Other practices would have an increase of 6%. So on the right-hand side is an alternative model. So we are using the major tenets of Primary Care First, which is a group approach, but this is a money follows the person model. So this is a little more similar to the way the current Track 2 program works, in which a beneficiary is assigned to a single group based on their specific HCC score. The practice will then receive a primary-based payment that is specific to that beneficiary's risk, and it would be their population-based payment is the aggregate of all of the payments for all of their beneficiaries across the different groups. This does have the potential to increase overall payments for Track 2 practices. It's an increase of 11.5%. But again, there are provider-specific impacts. There are some providers that would lose under this model. They would have a reduction in payment of 21%, or an increase of payment ranging to an increase of payment of 38%. All right, I think now would be actually if we can go one more slide, and then I think we're going to pause for initial questions. This is a quick introduction of the required policymaking decisions that need to be made. So decisions need to be made on whether we want to focus the Track 3 on a practice group or on a beneficiary group, and we'll walk through again those two models in detail. And there are multiple decisions on how the flat fee is constructed. All of the results that I'm going to show you today are going to be based on the first option, which is includes all E&Ms covered under the flat fee consistent with PCF, but there are other alternatives we'll cover. So now, before we jump into the detail of the population-based payment, I want to pause and make sure that there's no introductory questions before we get into detail.
And while you all are thinking about your questions, Dr. Riedman, joining us is Dr. Pham and Dr. Berkowitz. Any questions for Audrey? Dr. Barr.
I think my mom had her hand up.
Yeah. My apologies.
That's fine.
I'll come back.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, one quick question and one clarification. Actually, probably two questions. I'm assuming we're not dealing with anybody who's in track 1 for this analysis, correct? We're leaving them aside, they're held constant, and they just would stay in track 1 for the future, the near future?
That is correct. We're only looking at the implications of changing from track 2 to track 3. There are no assumptions made of track 1 beneficiary or track 1 practices changing their track affiliation.
Fair enough. And then this is more of a question to Howard and team. What are the goals for this payment? Are we trying to incentivize folks and pay them better for this, or trying to keep things neutral? Just trying to get what are the goals for this payment model? I can see the analysis, but I don't know what the goals specifically are for this.
Yeah, so Michael, naturally, you raised a very good and essential question. I think the goals are to make sure that we're in alignment with the total cost of care, the model, and that it's successful over time and meets all of its goals. And even as we do that, that we're providing sufficient funding to have a broad primary care workforce across the state that is providing the kind of care that's necessary to improve the health of for this model, this portion of the model, for the beneficiaries that are served. So they're sufficiently funded to do that, while at the same time that they are held accountable for those funds so that they're used appropriately to improve the health of the population. So and part of the goal in this particular process is to move those practices, as many as are able to move along this trajectory to increasing responsibility and accountability, while moving them also to population-based payments, moving away from fee-for-service, not completely, but substantially. And as we do that, taking that larger portion of the payments, overall payments that are then population-based and not fee-for-service, and making them at risk. And putting them at risk. So it creates a greater degree of accountability and risk while increasing the overall amount of payment.
Well, so I appreciate that, but more specifically, so far there's no quality component to this. We're just looking at the population-based stuff, and people to move into track 3. It looks like, at least by either of these models, there's a significant risk they have less revenue in the model, if I'm understanding correctly.
And Alana, could you back up to slide 7, please?
Yeah. So they will actually, this is, we're not at that point yet, but there's the performance-based adjustments would be based on quality and alignment with the state integrated health improvement strategy and other measures that would define the effectiveness of primary care.
Understood. I'm just saying that even before you get to that point, at least on this modeling, there's significant downside for some practices according to this. That's my only point. And if that's acceptable, that's what I'm trying to get at. If it's not, then the model obviously is not going to work.
Right. I think as we go further through this, I think we'll see that there's more refinements and as you point out, the need to be made. And I think some will be discussed in the detail later.
So I think Dr. Pham and then Dr. Berenson.
I had several questions, Audrey, and I'm sorry to quick fire them at you. One is, are you able to disaggregate for us what the drivers are for practices that see a drop in revenue versus those that see an increase? What are the specific characteristics that drive that? A second question relates to the risk adjustment. This is just straight PCF risk adjustment. This is normal HCCs. This does not make use of the new modified HCC methodology that CMS has already produced for direct contracting. Is that correct? Even for the severely ill track, which you're not segregating out here, but they're included as part of the general population, yes.
That is correct. So let me take your first question. What are the drivers of loss or gain for these practices? And the largest driver is the current composition of beneficiaries based on their existing risk tier. So what you're going to see is that you have beneficiaries going into group 1 on this left side model based on their overall average HCC score for the practice. But within that, there is a considerable there's a huge range of where the beneficiaries currently lie with their track 2 risk tier. And it's that distribution of risk tier that's going to determine if practices ultimately gain or lose under these individual models.
And just to dig down one layer more, this is using historical data for a theoretical performance year of 2021, correct? What performance year are you presupposing here?
Well, we're using the current payment rates of PCF, and we're using the current MDPCP tier payments of 2020. So effectively, you can say it's a 2021 with the assumption that the CMF payments currently for track 2 would remain unchanged as they have in the past.
Well, okay, the payments will remain unchanged, but the risk scores may not. I'm making this too complicated.
No, that's okay.
When this model actually goes live, will calendar year 2020 be used for risk adjustment?
That is, okay, that's a slightly different question. So we are using the beneficiary attribution as of Q3 2020, which is using HCC scores from CMS that actually go back to 2019. So there are several limitations in using CMS's risk tiers because they are so dated at this point.
I'm just alerting folks that this scenario can look even more dramatically distorted once calendar year 2020 risk scores are applied. And it may be distorted in pretty unpredictable ways. That's all.
Yep, I think that's an excellent point. Adjustment in the HCC scores could have a significant impact in the risk tier of the beneficiary, the current risk tier of the beneficiary, and ultimately the grouping under this model. So we have the underlying assumption that we need to keep it static for right now, just to get an overall assessment of the model. But there might be an opportunity to introduce various levers that have changes in risk or complexity, because it could certainly drive the results as you indicated.
And then just one last question, Audrey, I apologize. Do we have any evidence over the history of the model up to date of coding practices having changed? Do we either have anecdotal evidence from the groups that have been working with these practices, or do we see evidence in migration of the risk scores?
We do see migration patterns in the evidence of the risk score when we look at 2019 versus 2020 attribution of beneficiaries, but we have not done an analysis that looks specifically at the track 2 practices and their changes. So I think it's something definitely worth noting of, as the HCC model that CMS currently uses was 2018 for program year 1 and 2019 for program year 2. And over that time period, we have seen changes, increases and decreases in the same beneficiary's risk score over time. So I think it's definitely something worth, it's something that we need to look into.
I think it is worth a discussion, I think it's worth more analysis. I think it's also worth a discussion with I forget what we call the organizations that support the practices. You know, optimizing coding is not anybody's notion of an ideal productive way to spend time. But the way that CMS has arranged this game, you have to run a lot to stand still. And I think we need to be honest with the practices and with ourselves about what the implications of that are, especially if CMS ends up using 2020 calendar data for risk scoring in the future. If they want to just skip over 2020 and perhaps even 2021 and just stick with 2019 data for several years, it's not looking great, but at least it's predictable.
It is, yes. I think that's a fair point. It's predictable, but there could be implications of doing so as well as you get further away from that time period.
Dr. Berenson.
So I'm back at basics. I apologize. On this table, on these preliminary results, do these results include fee schedule payments for track 2 current and projected visit payments, fixed visit payments for track 3, or is this just PM payments?
Nope, this is the total payment. So this is going to be your population-based payment plus your E&M payment. So under your current model, it's fee-for-service 2021 rates. Under your modeled payment, we're using our flat fee that we're going to talk through in a few minutes on how that's constructed. So this would be the total.
What assumption did you use in producing these numbers about that flat fee?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
What assumption did you use in calculating the track 3 model payments about the level of payment for the flat fee?
That's a great question. We have 3 different models that we're going to walk you through on 3 possible constructs for the flat fee model. The results here are based on the assumption that of the 39 E&M codes that are going to be subjected to the flat fee, we take the national proposed 2021 payment rates, come up with a weighted average, and apply that as the flat fee rate. So it's actually a budget neutral model on the E&M side. We have 2 other alternatives that are not budget neutral, and you'll see significant differences when we get through that.
Okay, so I'll have some questions about that. But do you have any sort of rough estimate of what percentage of revenues before we get to performance bonuses that a practice gets from the monthly payment versus the fee schedule payments in the 2 categories?
I do. Yeah, I do. It's roughly, E&M payments are a little bit more than half. So under this model, we have 75 let's look on the left side, we have 86 million for current payments and 75 million for modeled payments. Slightly more than half of that is attributed to the E&M payments. So E&M payments are 45 million. So they're kind of the stabilizer under a budget neutral scenario, which we have modeled here for E&Ms. That's kind of the stabilizer, whereas the population-based payment is kind of where the swing is coming from.
So
and we'll break it down into the
percentages are the same and for track 2 and track 3 in the left table here.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Can you repeat
that? In other words, the same percentage of total is coming from fee schedule payments for both track 2 and track 3 and the practice group analysis. You haven't modified the percentage until.
Yeah, no, it is slightly different. So on the left side model, E&M represents $40.1 million of the total. So it represents a little bit more than half of current payment. And it's significantly more of the modeled payment because that per beneficiary per month payment is gone down in the model. We have it broken down in a future slide, and we can look at
Okay, I'll wait. Thank you.
So, Dr. Pham, I think Dr. Kiki had a question, and we'll come back to you.
Yeah, my question was about the adjustments, the assumptions made for the model payment, but she said she'll discuss that later on, so I'll wait to hear. Thank you.
Okay, you bet. Dr. Pham.
Yeah, Audrey, I see the spread. Can you give us a sense of how clustered this was? What was the, I mean, I see the average and I see the spread. Are we talking about the majority of practices basically being budget neutral or better? Are we talking about the majority of them being right on the bubble? What does the bell curve actually look like? Sure.
We have a slide coming up that has a provider impact by percentile for both of these models. So we can look at the distribution, there. It is a bit of a bell curve. It's not particularly skewed, but we can review those results. Actually, looking at it now, it's a bell curve, fairly well distributed.
Around 0 or around something positive?
Oh, no, negative? Around the 12.5. So you have your overall average of negative 12.5%. So it's a 12.5% reduction. That is effectively become that's your average overall. You have practices losing significantly kind of on both sides of that. You also have practices that are well positive.
And can
Mhm.
you remind us, folks in the program probably know this, intuitively, but I can't remember. What is their revenue now in track 2 relative to their baseline fee for service? How does that compare to the 12.5%? So they're in track 2 right now. How well are they doing relative to not being in the model?
So there's no flat fee component of track 2 currently. So they are receiving, so the population-based payment is not replacing any fee-for-service component of their care. I guess there are a few select E&M services that they're not allowed to be billing anymore, the care coordination services, but it is not a flat fee payment that is replacing a fee-for-service arrangement.
Understood. But what's the delta for them?
I don't have that available, but I can certainly look into that.
I just think that's an important data point for us, because now if we present this data to them, their business decision will be, am I better off just dropping out of the program?
Howard, do you or Chad have that data?
So you mean in terms of what percentage is for the care management fees, what percentage does that represent of total Medicare revenue?
What advantage does it give them over not being in the model, Howard?
So for being in track 2, it's probably in the range of a 10 or 15% increase in overall. This is track 2 overall revenue. Don't quote me on the exact number, but something in that range.
Okay.
But the interesting thing there is that that's not at risk, and in Primary Care First, so the only part that's at risk in track 2 is the performance bonus, which is
Right.
4%.
So looking at the practice group scenario, that would on average knock them back to where they were before the program at all, and they would be taking on risk.
Correct.
And they would be doing the work.
Correct.
That's why I was asking about the goals earlier, because that was
Yeah.
missing.
So, clearly our goals are to make sure that we have sufficient inflow of revenue to the practices so that they can do the work. And I would say if more of that revenue is at risk, it needs to be more than the overall, the base amount needs to be more than where they are now. If you're putting more of it at risk, it needs to be higher. So those are the goals.
I think, I'm sorry for hogging the airtime. I think that this will come up in conversation later, but at some point, it would be good for us to try to gather some intel, perhaps from the professional societies, about how this analysis compares to what assumptions they are making about the offering of primary care first to practices not in Maryland, who may be, for example, in CPC Plus right now, and who may be getting tired and flagging, and who may see themselves not on the bubble and not in the positive area of this curve, but in a far worse scenario. I realize that the agency has been very clear that they want Maryland to mirror as much as possible the primary care first methodology. But if that primary care first methodology is going to meet with a less than enthusiastic response from the primary care first audience, then I don't see what benefit there is for Maryland in following, that movement off the cliff. But for a discussion later.
I think those are great discussion points.
So we have a couple more questions. I think Dr. Barr was asking a question, and then Debbie. No, Melanie, please.
I sent one in on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the question I have is Bob's.
Oh, Bob, my apologies. So you were up before Debbie, and then we'll follow with Debbie. So you're up.
The question Bob put in, do you want me to go with Bob's question that was in the chat, David?
I yield to Bob.
I can read it. I can just say it.
Okay.
I thought it might be picked up simply. Okay. The question is, the practice group analysis is based on an average risk score And the beneficiary group analysis is averaging the payment for individual beneficiaries. Is that the distinction there?
No, the beneficiary group analysis is each beneficiary is put into a group based on their specific HCC score. So it is not an average. It's money follows the person the same way that the risk tier currently works in track 2. So if a beneficiary has an HCC score of 1.1, they would fall into group 1 of the beneficiary group, because the group 1 threshold is for all beneficiaries with an HCC score less than 1.2. So in a practice, they would have a combination of beneficiaries, possibly across all of these groups, based on the HCC thresholds used in Primary Care First. Was that clear?
It's helpful. I can't say as I'm fully following, but keep going.
So I think Debbie had a question, and then Dr. Preiminary, I believe you were going to make a comment.
Yeah, I'm sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank goodness. So I'm listening to this conversation, and I know I'm oversimplifying, but given the concerns I've raised before about the fact that not all practices are the same, and there are significant differences in HCCs among the practices that aren't currently fully accounted for. When Dr. Pham asked about the distribution, and you said it was a bell curve, am I correct in hearing you that then the practices that are most likely to lose on the left side of that curve are the ones with the more complex patients, the more severe? I mean, that's what it sounded like when you said that the drivers are very much about HCC.
The drivers are very much about the current risk tier of the beneficiaries in those attributed practices. So under the model to the left, you can have a practice that has an overall HCC score of 1.1, which would put them into group 1. When they are in group 1, the practice is going to receive $28 per member per month for every beneficiary that's attributed to them. However, that 1.1 may consist of a large percent of beneficiaries that are complex and have a high HCC score, and a large population of beneficiaries that have much lower complexity and have, a 0.5, 0.8 other HCC score. So it is the actual distribution of those beneficiaries by risk tier that is driving whether they are kind of where they fall on that continuum of the overall impact.
Okay, and the reason I think that this is a really important point is that we see in the data that the hospital-based practices have more complex patients than ambulatory-based. And so, again, this is not a conversation for tonight, but as the HSCRC is talking about how to connect MDPCP participation and policies, it's a problem, I think, for hospital-based practices in general, given what we're talking about here, to Dr. Pham's point about the drivers. I don't think we want to deter or discourage participation in practices that need the care management infrastructure the most because of the complexity of the patients that need to be managed. And I know that's probably oversimplified, but that's what I'm hearing, that there might be unintended consequences, and participation is key in order to move the needle. So.
And Debbie, I think that's exactly why we're going through this exercise, to tease out those unintended consequences and to be able to be more intentional about creating a design for this track 3 that eliminates as much of that as possible. And clearly this side-by-side comparison shows there's significant differences between you're taking an average HCC score and characterizing a practice by the average and assuming that they only take care of less sick patients, as opposed to letting the money follow the person, which allows at least at one level, to let the some indicator, whether it's the right indicator or not, or whether it's the most current or not, but let that describe how much investment should be made on behalf of that patient, rather than just saying, in this example, we would have no practices that take care of on the average sick patient. We have no group 3 and group 4 in the state. That seems to be on its surface unrealistic.
Dr. Reedman.
So thanks. I think the comments have been great so far. Audrey, I have two questions, actually kind of follow up on some points others have made. Though, do you have any idea what the payments are, the downside would be compared to track 1 right now? The track 1 payments for most practices, they're doing well with that, they're doing okay with it, but in track 2, in theory, is higher reimbursement. So that 21% down, for example, how does that compare to what they're making right now with track 1? Do you have a handle on that? Would that put them right where track 1 is, or that's to be below track 1?
That's an interesting question. We haven't looked at it from that perspective, but I'd be happy to go back and anchor it back to the track 1 payments, because they are slightly lower than track 2 for the same tiers. I think that's an interesting question. I'd like to look into that.
Okay. The other question I have was, Dr. Pham brought up the issue of, how is this distributed? Well, my concern is, how does this, or do you have a handle on whether this upside and downside affects the smaller practices more than the larger? Are there a lot more of the smaller practices in that negative 21%, or is it pretty evenly distributed amongst the larger and smaller practices? We've talked a number of times, and it was just probably tonight, about HCC scores, and we talked about, my group uses Epic, we're large, we have coders embedded in our sites, all of that. It really helps us with our HCC scores, and it takes some of that burden off the physicians. But in particular, the smaller practices don't have the resources or funding to do that, and they really get hurt by not appropriately scoring the HCC scores, as we've said before, because they're concentrated on patient care, which I will argue, I think we all will, is more important. But the smaller practices really have a time getting those HCC scores in. So I'm concerned about that. I'm not sure that's going to peruse over what this committee is going to change, but I do worry that some of the smaller practices may be unequally distributed in that down 21%.
That's a great question. We actually talked about that as a group a little bit earlier today, that we provide a provider impact analysis just at the overall practice level, but we do want to slice and dice that to get much more refined, to look at what the impact is by practice size, as well as CTO affiliation. And I like the idea of also bringing in the hospital-based affiliation, whether it's CTO or none. And I think there are several other aspects about the practices that we can bring in and provide a provider analysis, provide an impact analysis, so you can see exactly who is falling in, which practices are falling into the high side and the low side. So I don't have that right now, but that's something we're definitely going to be looking into.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, any other questions before we move on? Okay.
Okay.
I'll agree.
All right, thank you. Let's do it. So let's get, if you can please advance to slide 10. So we're going to now talk about population-based payment only. So as I introduced before, you have your population-based payment that is then added to your E&M flat fee component to produce the total. Excuse me. What I previously just shared with you is the total impact, but let's talk about each of the individual components separately. So this slide is almost a summary at this point, but these are the two different models that we've looked at. So just to make sure we're all on the same point, and if there's any questions, I'd like to address them now. Our first model is a practice group. So this is consistent with the National PCF program. All of the beneficiaries attributed to an individual practice are looked at in aggregate. So the HCC scores for those beneficiaries are averaged together to produce a practice-specific average HCC score. Based on the HCC thresholds of the Primary Care First program, that practice is placed into a single group. Regardless of the distribution of those beneficiaries by risk tier, by HCC score, the practice is going to receive the same population-based payment for every beneficiary in their practice. So I think the example I used before is if the practice has an average HCC score of 1.1, that practice is assigned to Group 1. Group 1 has a population-based payment of $28. That practice will receive $28 per member per month for every beneficiary attributed to them. On the alternative side, we have a beneficiary group model where each beneficiary stands on their own. It is the beneficiary's specific HCC score, and each beneficiary is placed into a population-based group. So it is the same HCC thresholds used of PCF, but a beneficiary is in a group as opposed to an entire practice. The practice then receives a population-based payment for an individual beneficiary. So if there are, let's make it simple, there's 3 beneficiaries in a practice. I recognize that's not possible with the policy. A beneficiary is in Group 1, a beneficiary is in Group 2, and a beneficiary is in Group 3. The practice is going to receive a PBP of $28 for Group 1 beneficiary, $45 for the Group 2 beneficiary, and $100 for the Group 3 beneficiary. So there is no practice aggregate or practice specific group. Each beneficiary stands on their own, and it's a money follows the person type model. Very similar to how Track 2 is currently handled. Any questions on the differences in the group construction before we keep going?
Dr. Reedman.
I just not a question, but a comment that the concern about the both these models, the money following the person. If you look at practice that has 100 really sick patients, and I probably do have 100 really sick patients. That's most of my work. Those other 500 Medicare beneficiaries I have are less complex. Well, I'm not sure there are any Medicare patients that are less complex, but assume that they're less complex. If the money's following the group, I'm getting paid for those. Most of my income is based on those 400 patients with the lower score versus the 100 that I'm really spending time with. In my mind, that first model is detrimental to the practices that are really taking care of sick patients. So more of my comment than anything else.
And that, again, is, I think, the largest driver of what makes a practice kind of win or lose under this model is their distribution of their current population base. So what proportion of their beneficiaries are Tier 4 or complex, and what are the HCCs associated with those beneficiaries as opposed to those in the lower tiers?
Other questions or comments at the moment? Okay, Audrey.
Okay, let's go to the next slide then. So this is a breakdown of the population-based payments for the practice group analysis. So the first thing of note that you've seen so far is that we don't have any practices that fit into Group 3 or Group 4. So Group 3 represents a practice with an average HCC score between 1.5 and 2.0, and Group 4 would be an average HCC score of 2.0 and 2.0 or greater. And we have no practices that have an average HCC score that fits into either of those groups. So we are concentrating our 122 practices into Group 1 and Group 2. You'll see the vast majority of them, 93,000 of the about 100,000, are falling into Group 1. What's interesting about this model is if you look at, we do have an overall reduction of about 24% in total per beneficiary per month payments. And we were initially thrown off by this. I wasn't expecting this result. But when we looked at the distribution of the average CMF payments under Track 2 compared to the population-based payments, it started to make a little more sense. So we found that the average CMF payment for practices in Group 1 was $37. So on average right now, practices in Group 1 are receiving per beneficiary per month payments of $37 per beneficiary. And when they're in Group 1, they'll be receiving $28 per beneficiary per month. For group 2, currently practices are receiving $53 per beneficiary per month. And under the modeled PCF practice group analysis, they'd be receiving $45 per beneficiary per month. So this just shows that it is the distribution of the beneficiaries by their current tier that is driving the reduction in payment under the population-based model.
So, Dr. Kiki, did you have a question?
No, she shares more clarity into what may be the reason for the variability. So this is for the PBP. I think the only thing I was also waiting on, it maybe it's in a future slide, is for the flat fee. Correct, Audrey? Okay.
Yep, we'll have a whole section on that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Fong.
I just want to point out how broad these spreads are within group 1 or group 2. These are just huge spreads. And this is, I can't think of a behavioral economist who would think that good things would come from this. It's, you know, it presents all kinds of adverse selection incentives. They're very wide spreads within each of these groups.
So, Dr. Pham, can you elaborate just a little bit more? I think that might help for some of the others.
Well, it means that within either group 1 or group 2, you have practices who are being grossly overpaid and practices who are being grossly underpaid based on their actual risk scores, because the money is not following the beneficiary, right? It's averaged. So you're getting grossly distorted incentives in both directions. And I'm just concerned that that will dwarf the overarching model incentive for people to do the right thing. This is a significant chunk of their revenue.
Yeah, good point. Any other comments at this point? Okay.
Let me just
Dr. Berenson.
Yeah, I mean, why even have these groups? I guess I don't know. What is it that CMS, do they think it's simpler, administratively simpler? Why not just pass through HCC scores on a beneficiary basis?
Dr. Berenson, we can only speculate on that. I think the language in the RFA suggests that it was to simplify the process for practices and allow them to not have to focus on HCC scores. But we don't have.
So pay inappropriately is simpler. That's true. I agree with that.
And it's somehow a different set of infrastructure than what they have had to build for next gen ACO or for direct contracting or for MA. I mean, it's sitting over there. It's just, you know, on the other side of the agency, and it's somehow unreachable for this model.
Yeah. Points for Bob.
I guess we're all scratching our heads a little bit. What's the sort of, I don't want to totally interrupt Audrey's flow, but I mean, what's the end game here? Are we choosing between these two models? Are we talking about trying to tweak payment levels? Are we, you know, it seems like one thing that we want to try to do, are we trying to customize this to Maryland in some fashion so that it's more palatable? What are we aiming for in this?
Bob, yeah, Bob, I think, you know, one of the first questions is, are we willing to accept the model that says we take the average of HCC scores and put practices into those groups as is defined here? So that's the step one. There's further refinements, and as we go through this presentation, you'll see there are clearly further refinements that we will have to make. But at one level, I think it's the fundamental question: do we want to have money follow the person as we have now, or do we want to move to the primary care first average HCC score? So that's one clear decision point. There are clearly going to be other refinements to get it absolutely perfectly aligned, but that is one big block decision.
Thank you.
So I can't see a from what we've looked at here and I looked at before, I just can't see the advantage of going with the practice group for anybody. The other question I have for you, Howard, maybe you can answer this. I think I know the answer, but as far as the question why we're doing group 1 and why group 2 and all, we don't really, this committee doesn't have any influence on whether Medicare is going to do that or not. Is that correct? I mean, we have to stick within the confines of what they're going to allow us to make changes or recommendations on, but that's kind of fixed by Medicare. Is that true?
I mean, the tiers for HCC scores for those?
Group 1 and group 2 and how all that's tiered and how that's really coming from Medicare, and that's not something the state's going to be able to change. Is that right?
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I think it would depend partially on modeling and things that we still need to do. But that we certainly don't want to. We can't change all the variables. But there are some that we do have some relatively easy control over. But changing the tiers or changing the amounts that are paid for each tier are certainly possible.
Okay. Thanks.
So, Dr. Haft, it's come up a couple times about the goal. What's the end goal? Could you just characterize for the advisory council what the PMO is looking for from the presentations of these slides?
Yeah, we would be very interested in understanding what the intention, the feeling of the advisory council about population-based payments, whether the practice grouping as described here, or the money follows the person, which is what the methodology we use now is preferred as the first kind of decision. So if we can get a sense of that, I think we'd be moving forward. There's many, many more decisions that need to be made, but that will help at least put us on one or another path for further decision making. And then if we can get through a little bit more, we might get to the flat fee portion also. Those would be two very critical decision points.
So, Dr. Haft, and then for the advisory council, I think Audrey has a couple more slides here, and perhaps we might be able to get to some dialogue about your point, Dr. Haft. So, Audrey, do you wish to continue?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next slide for slide 12 to show what the impact is by beneficiary group. And these, again, beneficiaries are assigned to the group based on their specific HCC score. And we do have an auto assignment logic that is consistent with the way the PCF works, that beneficiaries without enough claims history to produce an HCC score are auto assigned to group 1. And you'll see that most of the beneficiaries are assigned to group 1 based on their HCC score. Again, that is the threshold of having an HCC score less than 1.2. It's about 1/4 of the beneficiaries or so are captured in groups 2 through 4. Overall, the impact of a population-based payment based on beneficiary group is an increase in payment of about 22%. Again, practices could experience significant increases under this model, ranging from 25% to 50%. Or excuse me, let me restate that. Some individual practices could be seeing increases as much as 25 to 50%. That's not the lower bound. And when you look at it by group, you'll see that group 1 is almost budget neutral. You see a percent impact of just 0.1% increase in payment. Group 2 does have a loss. It does have a decrease in payment of about 14%, whereas groups 3 and 4 would see significant increases in payment. That's largely drawn just to the payment structure, where currently your tier 4 beneficiaries within track 2 have a per beneficiary per month payment of about $33, whereas if they were to be in group 3 or group 4, they have per beneficiary per month payments upwards of $100 to $175. So there is a big disconnect between just the payment rate between the two programs, and that's what's driving the increases in the group 3 and 4 beneficiaries.
And there was a qualifying point. Melanie, can you read the chat?
This is from Chad, and this is that the model assumes that beneficiaries do not drop off during the year, correct? And that this is static to Q3 of 2020.
Yes, thank you, Chad. So this is Q3 2020 attribution. We are assuming that beneficiaries remain attributed to the practice for the entire year. So it is fully static in that respect, that we are not changing the beneficiary attribution. We are not changing their complexity either.
Is it true, Audrey, am I reading it right, that this bell curve seems steeper and narrower than the bell curve for the other option?
At a provider specific level, I'd have to look at that more carefully. I don't recall off the top of my head.
Yeah, maybe I'm misreading it because I'm looking at the number of beneficiaries, and maybe that doesn't correlate to the number of practices. But
right. No, it certainly does not. I think the challenge here is that you have the vast majority of your beneficiaries in Group 1, and it's more of your outliers in 2, 3, and 4 that have the swings. But I like your idea. I do want to look at the bell curve distribution of our provider impact and expand that a bit, and I think that'll provide a lot of useful information for you to consider.
Yeah, I think that would be super helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
And Dr. Berenson, was there a point you wish to make at this point? Okay. I guess back to you, Audrey.
Okay, I suggest that we actually get into flat fee, which is next. So the next slide was just going to be a summary of our practice group or beneficiary group, but I feel like we had yes?
So just to interrupt you there. So Howard asked the question about, actually, I'm sorry, you're throwing it up right now, so never mind, keep going.
Well, I was actually going to defer to the team. Is this, we talked about this a bit already. Do we want to continue the discussion on practice group versus beneficiary, or do we want to look at flat fee?
So
I'd like to ask the group if they feel comfortable that we should make a decision based on this today, or do we want to look at more data and have a further conversation at the next meeting? Are we comfortable with the discussion we've had today? So I'd throw it to the group to see if we can come to some kind of consensus today on this issue, and if not, we can certainly get more data and think about it and have more conversation.
And Dr. Reedman, could I also interject that if it's not a decision and there's a request for more data, that if there is a general sense or feeling of one way or the other, that that's shared as well. Is that a friendly amendment, Dr. Reedman?
Absolutely. Perfect.
Okay. So I think there was a question, Melanie, or a comment from Dr. Barr.
Yes. And then I was also going to say I can send a poll out if you guys want me to.
No. I think we just.
Okay. So Dr. Barr said, are we able to adjust the PBP payment PBPM amounts, or are they fixed?
So I can give a technical answer. There's also probably a policy decision, a policy answer that Dr. Haff may want to provide. Technically, we can absolutely modify our PBP payment rates. What our intent was to take the PCF policy at its core, align with it as much as possible, and apply that to track 3 in order to provide an introduction to what the track would look like if there was perfect alignment with PCF. From a technical perspective, we can certainly modify those results. If you actually look at the slides, I don't know if we need to go through it right now. At the very end of the presentation, I believe it's the last slide, there's actually a sensitivity analysis of what payment rates would need to be in order to make payment overall the same. Modeled payments equal current payments in aggregate, not at an individual practice level. So there is some flexibility from a technical perspective. But Dr. Haft, I'll defer to you from a policy perspective if you want to deviate from the PCF requirements.
So Audrey and others, I think that those are all open questions and possible. I think we want to wind up in a place that at the end provides again sufficient funding, is fair and balanced in the way it distributes that funding, and at the same time moves us to larger amounts of population-based payments and puts those larger amounts at risk so as to align with the total cost of care. How we go about doing that, I think, is is going to be a lot of the work that we do now in terms of the big blocks, and then we'll have a period of time after that in terms of refining the smaller points of it, which might be the amount of payment for a particular tier, or the limitation of a particular HCC score. I think those are all possible alterations in the future. But I think we're trying to decide now chocolate or vanilla, and later we'll decide whether it's vanilla with nuts in it, or whether it's chocolate with marshmallows, and make those little nuances later on.
So is it fair to say that there's a request for additional analysis, and that Audrey is understands and is planning to propose, but it feels like it's the sense of the group that there's more interest in the slogan "money follows the patient," as opposed to where it's considered at the practice. So is that fair to say? And let me ask Dr. Pham to weigh in here.
I think so. I guess I would couch the desire for additional analyses as an effort to bolster our argument to CMS that this is not the path to go. We probably want to take a closer look at the dollar follows the Benny method to make sure that we're confident in that. But it seems like it's clear that that's the preferable path at threshold.
Yeah, and Bob, I see you nodding. Did you have some thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I can't say as I'm ready to be conclusive.
Understood.
But that's the more intuitive thing. I mean, if the only benefit, I agree that this needs to be. I think Dr. Pham is saying, push back on the whole PCF concept entirely. I want to understand that what the options are here, because I think that ship has sort of at least halfway sailed. But the only as I was listening. And I can't say as I've mastered the math here, it seems like the only advantage of the other model is that you don't require practice to be able to report the HCC score of its own, or the detailed diagnoses of individual beneficiaries. That just comes out of other sources. And so I would, in this one, I don't know that I have a dog in the fight so much as wanting to make sure that the practices are comfortable with whatever works and maximize their participation and engagement and doing the right thing.
So thank you, Bob. I believe we heard Dr. Reedman's point of view in that looking at it from a money follows the patient approach would be more of an accurate representation of the sense of the group here. Dr. Reedman, is that your thinking as well?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the consensus I'm getting, or I think it's the feeling I'm getting, that we should put our emphasis on that, analyzing that. I'm not sure that the group practice, the practice group part of it is more concerns for me, and I think most of the others in the committee. So again, I think we will bring this back to our next meeting to have some more analysis, more discussion, but it sounds like we're more leaning toward, I think everybody agrees, the beneficiary group, at least superficially, or in this level of detail, looks like the more beneficial program.
So thank you, Dr. Reedman. Dr. Okiki, and I would just say before you begin, if there's anyone who has a general sense that the money should follow the practice, after Dr. Okiki, if you could just share your point of view, we can note that as well.
Yeah, and I just speaking from the provider's perspective, why I think is really important to follow the patient is because this is MDPCP focused on fee-for-service Medicare beneficiaries. The practices have to align their advancement in primary care transformation with other payers, and most other payers are doing similar things, which is for payment reform, which is follow the patient. So I think also looking at things from the provider's lenses is very helpful. So that's another reason why I will support that beneficiary group model.
Thank you.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to make a suggestion that maybe If Audrey has a couple more slides to get through before we talk about the fixed payment, then let's try to finish that part up real quick, and then we can kind of have some wrap up or comments and see if there's any other comments along on her presentation.
Understood. Audrey.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We're going to get into the flat fee payment construction on slide 15. We have 3 different models. So let me just give a quick lay of the land. Primary Care First has a flat fee payment rate that is based on a level 2 E&M service. That is 99212. They are suggesting a flat fee payment of about, it was $40.82 or so. When we look at the distribution of services for Track 2 practices based on 2019 utilization, we find that 70% of the E&M services that would be subjected to this flat fee are for level 3 and 4 E&Ms, 99213 and 99214. So right out of the gate, we're seeing a bit of a disconnect between what PCF is suggesting as the anchor for the flat fee and what the billing practices are for Track 2 practices. For purpose of just ballpark or just kind of directionality, the 39 E&M services that would be subjected to this flat fee represent only 44% of this, well, I shouldn't say only, 44% of the services provided by the practice, but represent 80% of the total allowed payments. So just want to give you that reference point that when we talk about a change in payment for E&M services, it is very much kind of the tail that wags the dog. It is the majority of the payments for these practices. So we have 3 different payment options that are constructed for developing our flat fee. The first one is the one that is integrated into the modeling that you've seen so far, and that is using a weighted average Medicare payment for all of the 39 E&M services that are going to be covered under this flat fee. This is a budget neutral policy. So to say that again, there are 39 services that if you were to bill them, you would receive the flat fee payment rate. We take the weighted average of all of those payments to determine what our flat fee should be.
I'm sorry, Audrey, budget neutral relative to what?
Budget neutral relative to the current payment that they receive under fee for service.
In the primary care program?
In the primary,
okay.
In the primary care program, yes.
Thanks.
The second option is using a subset of those E&M services. So it's using 99211 through 99215. It is the weighted average national Medicare fee-for-service payment for that subset of 6 services. The third option is going back to what PCF is doing, which is using the single code of 99212, again, consistent with Primary Care First, and using that to determine the payment rate that is then applied to all 39 E&M services that are subjected to the flat fee. Let's look at the next slide, because I think since this is the one that drives the model, that drives the payment results, this is one of the most critical ones to cover. You see on the right side the overall distribution of E&M services billed by Track 2 practices in calendar year 2019. We reprice all of those codes based on the Medicare physician fee schedule for 2021. And we produce an overall weighted average payment of $116. If you look at the distribution for 99213 and 214, I mentioned earlier that 70% of all E&M services are encompassed by these 2 codes, and you see that here, with their payment rates of $86 and $122 respectively. So at first blush, we're saying that there's a weighted average payment rate of $116. However, under the PCF methodology, you receive a single flat fee regardless of how many E&M services are provided per patient per day. And based on our claims analysis, we found that about 13.5% of claims had more than one of these E&Ms on them. So 13.5% of claims had more than one of the E&M services on the right side on a given claim, or provided to a beneficiary within a given day. In order to account for that, we inflate our weighted average flat fee rate by 13.5%, and we have an adjusted flat fee payment of $132. So to give you a perspective of the PCF methodology flat fee payment is based on 99212, payment rate of $40. We are saying if you factor in all of the E&Ms and you account for multiple E&M services for a given beneficiary, the flat fee payment is $132. This is budget neutral with the current fee-for-service payments that these practices receive currently. So if you go to the next slide, I will show you the budget neutrality aspect of it. Under both our current E&Ms, which are fee-for-service billed, just current fee-for-service, and our flat fee E&M payments, we have $40.1 million in total payment. And it does have a slight percent impact by group, but overall is budget neutral.
So, Audrey, I think, Dr. Reedman, I think there's some questions. I believe Dr. Berenson has a thought here.
You're muted, Dr. Berenson.
No, I have a thought, but I want to hear the end of the presentation. I just was shaking my head at what doesn't work in my mind. So go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead then, Audrey.
Okay, so let's look at the next model. So that first model was saying, what does the payment rate have to be budget neutral with current E&M services so that practices do not receive a reduction or an increase in payment, consistent with PCF's concept of making the flat fee kind of net neutral. They didn't want to incentivize in-person visits. They didn't want to disincentivize in-person visits. So on the next slide is our next permutation. Oh, excuse me. No, the next slide is the beneficiary group impact, and I think we can likely skip this for now. This is all E&M services. It's putting it into the beneficiary group model as opposed to the practice model, and it remains budget neutral. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this permutation is using E&M services 99211 through 99215 only. So it is excluding those other E&M services from the calculation of the flat fee. This produces an average, a national weighted average of $110 as a flat fee. But once you account for multiple E&M services, the flat fee would be $125. So in our previous model, we had a $132 flat fee. Using a subset of the services, we have $125. This is no longer budget neutral. It would produce a 5% reduction in payment for practices for E&M services alone. And once you factor in this construction with the population-based payments that we saw earlier, it is a further reduction in payment of 3 percentage points. So just to kind of anchor that, we previously said there was a 12.5% reduction under our practice group model. If we were to use this E&M construction, that would reduce payments further by 3 percentage points. Let's just do the last slide. The last slide is that third construction, which is most akin to a primary care first. So this is taking the primary care first structure of 99212, but inflating it to 2021 payment rates. The 2021 payment rate for 99212 is $54.20. Accounting for multiple E&M services provided, we would suggest a flat fee of $62. However, $62 is not the same as $132 that was the budget neutral model. This would produce a 39% reduction in payment for E&M services alone. And when you factor in the population-based payment changes, it would be an additional 18 percentage point reduction in overall payment. So I know I just threw a lot of numbers at you, but the general idea here is aligning with primary care first would reduce would reduce payment for E&M services for these practices by 39%.
So, Dr. Friedman, we're at 4 minutes before the time. How would you like to propose we proceed?
Yeah, I perfect timing. First of all, Audrey, thanks a lot. That was an excellent introduction, and especially the time constraints. And I think that rather than opening it up for questions tonight, we only really have a few more minutes. I'd like to summarize this meeting and then we'll start back with the flat fee payment and give everybody a week to kind of think about it, think about your questions. Certainly, if you have other questions for us, let us know beforehand, and maybe we can clarify some of that in the interest of time for next meeting. But I really appreciate Audrey's input today, and the presentation I thought was excellent. I thought the conversation was excellent. I'll throw it back to you, David, and Melanie to kind of, and Howard and Ben for final comments.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. So, Melanie, if you could do an operations update, and then we'd invite our executive director to make some comments.
Yes, thank you, David. So as usual, we will have a high-level meeting summary and a video that will be posted online. We do plan to have a meeting next week at this time slot between 5 and 6:30. And that's all I have for now. Back to you, David.
Ben, your thoughts, comments?
I see a lot of people rubbing their head, and you know, I want to just sort of back up. I think we could get to a quote unquote fairer model, either through the practice group or the beneficiary assignment, and we're going to have to kind of make a judgment here as we negotiate with CMMI on what's most beloved in the model. In Primary Care First, because I think that is a factor we have to consider. It's going to take us longer to get to quote unquote a fair model using the practice group, and may require manipulation of both the payment levels and the HCC tiers to balance that off. But that's really the only way I can see us getting to some sort of equilibrium on that model. The beneficiary approach does seem more appealing because it's easier, but I just don't know if that's anathema to CMMI, given what they've said about their rationale for selecting the practice group assignment. So I think what we need to think about and really solicit the advisory group's input in over the next several days is additional analyses that we might conduct, as well as some pretty hard thinking about what their thoughts are on the directions we ought to go, because it's not altogether clear to me. Perhaps Howard and Chad, who are more directly involved in discussions with CMMI about how tightly wed they are to the practice group assignment that is kind of a key anchor to Primary Care First.
Thank you, Ben. Dr. Haft, any final remarks before we close down?
No, thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for these great comments and in-depth look at what's been presented so far. I think that the reality is that CMS and CMMI has opened the door and said, we're willing to negotiate a contract that moves us to something that looks like the structure of Primary Care First, with moving us to population-based payments and a flat fee and a performance adjustment. I think the rest of the work is for us to decide how best to do that. And clearly, Maryland is a unique environment. It's not going to be Primary Care First. It cannot be that. It can only be a portion of the overall total cost of care model, and will still be Maryland Primary Care Program. So it's up to us to best define how to do that. And these were great deliberations moving in that direction tonight. So thank you all for your contributions, and it's going to get even better in the weeks to come, I guarantee.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I think Dr. Berenson wants to make a point.
I just wanted to ask, did we get this excellent presentation from Audrey in our materials before the meeting? I must admit I didn't look.
It's posted to the website, but we can send you out the link to. It's posted on the website.
Oh, I see. I'd appreciate it if you could send it out because there's information in there that I want to be able to look at in the week. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, everyone, thank you for your time. Have a great evening, rest of the week, and we'll see you next week this time, 5 o'clock.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.